Welcome to Uncommons. I'm Nate Erskine-Smith, and on this episode, I'm joined by Mark Carney. He is, of course, the former governor of the Bank of Canada. He's the former governor of the Bank of England, and he is also much more political these days, including joining a podcast like this to talk about not only politics, but liberal politics, because right now, he occupies the role of chair of an economic task force to the Liberal Party and Prime Minister, and he might well have a future in politics beyond that as well. Mark, thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Nate.
I was going to make a joke about how you are the first guest we've had since the Prime Minister, and people can read into that as they like. But I just want to start with why you're here in Toronto. Sustainable finance, and before people's eyes glaze over, maybe you can help ensure their eyes don't glaze over. But
I think we've lost the audience already.
What do you hope to see achieved through sustainable finance in terms of actual serious climate action?
Yeah, so first thing, thanks for having me. And I'm here, I'm giving a talk later on today at something called the PRI in Person, which is 2,000 people from around the world focused on more than just sustainable finance, but certainly sustainable finance. And I'm going to talk about that aspect of it, and specifically, what is the financial sector doing and not doing to get capital to solutions to address climate change? And in essence, that's what sustainable finance is. Success in sustainable finance will be when we can drop the adjective, when this just becomes mainstream. And all the work that I and others have been doing, particularly since 3 years ago, almost to the day, there was a COP, one of these big processes in Glasgow, where finance was at the heart of it. And we've been working to make sure that people have the information, first and foremost. And when I say people, I mean people, out here in the beaches, people working in the center of Wall Street or around the world, investors, people managing people's pensions, that they have the information that's needed in order to judge who's part of the solution and who's still part of the problem, that we have the right market structure. We need some new markets in order to solve this, and that we see action, and we can judge that action accordingly.
And before we get to the possible potential impact of that disclosure, the Canadian context. So you had said in 2019, I think, you'd expressed some frustration in one of your speeches about, and this wasn't specific to Canada, but the global pace of progress towards sustainable finance was moving far too slow. We wake up and it's 5 years later, and in Canada, we still haven't seen these rules put in place. And so what do you hope to see, hopefully sooner than later, here in Canada?
Yeah, well, let me give a global context first. It's a global event, global context. We operate in a global market. Capital moves around the world. And if I look at the world, you have over 700 of the world's largest financial institutions controlling over 40% of the financial assets in the world. Private finance, so huge numbers, $150 trillion, US dollars, at that matter, that these institutions oversee. They're all committed to shift the management of those assets consistent with the transition towards net zero. In other words, to help companies and countries and municipalities get their emissions down. Okay, that's what they're committed to do. And by the way, that what comes with that is if somebody isn't trying to get their emissions down, then money is shifting from those companies in one example to those who are doing something. So globally, you have a huge shift towards this, first thing. Secondly, it starts with just reporting on where you stand today. What does your portfolio look like? Who are you investing in or lending to? The next step, of course, is to have a plan. You don't solve anything without a plan. You got to put the plan in action. And as we meet today, we're in a situation where 500 of those 700 institutions have full-blown what's called a transition plan, but a plan to move the money, and they are moving the money towards the solutions. Fast forward to Canada, or shift to Canada, what we don't yet have is the disclosure regime fully operating so that Canadians can judge who's doing the right thing or not. A number of Canadian institutions are doing it voluntarily, but it's not required for everyone, like it is in Europe, like it is in the UK and elsewhere. And secondly, we don't have a framework, an accepted way or a consistent way of putting together those plans. And look, I've been through a bunch of crises over my time as a central bank governor and policymaker. And the one thing I know is in a crisis, plan beats no plan. You cannot get your way out of a situation without a plan. It's a It's a good motto for life, I guess, as well.
What do you make though? So we put the plans in place. We've got the disclosure regime, hopefully sooner than later, as I say.
Yeah.
And how do we move away from, take ESG, and there's promise to it, but there's also the bottom line, and a company will, as fast as anything, walk away from ESG if it no longer matters to their bottom line. And how does this differ from that?
Yeah, so I work in a subset of ESG, so ESG, environmental, social, and governance. I work on the environment bit of it, and I work in a subset of the environment, which is the transition towards a low-carbon economy or net zero. Because obviously in environment, there's nature and biodiversity and other aspects. I work in the bit where you can count very clearly what's happening, and that's part of what so-called disclosure is doing. And therefore, people are able to judge, again, who's part of the solution, who's still part of the problem. Now, in order to do that, in order for everyone to be able to make those judgments, they need access to that information in a way that they can, access it readily. It should be free, and it should be consistent. And one of the things that some of the voluntary work that I'm doing is to build out the net zero data public utility. First time that's been on the podcast.
Eyes
Eyes are now fully glazed. But what it means is that you can judge which of our banks,
right,
as of the middle of next year, which of our banks is doing well relative to the others, and how are they doing relative to other international banks. What happens today is somebody will write a report, and it'll become an argument about the quality of the data or the completeness of the data. So first is to get that information. The second, but the bigger point, which I think you're driving at, is, okay, but why are companies going to do this? Companies and financial institutions are going to do this because Canadians and people around the world want them to do it. After all, they elected a government, your government, over the course, and a number of provincial governments that have climate action at the core of their platforms. After all, it is the law of the land. It literally is the law of the land in Canada that we transition towards net zero. Now, how we do that requires certain policies from government, and a number are being put in place. More will be required without question. But financial institutions and companies in Canada and elsewhere around the world react to those policies, and they react to the values of people. And a lot of the work that I've done in recent years has been around getting the market, shorthand, value in the market, what's priced, to be consistent with what people care about, what people value, the values, in this case, of Canadians around sustainability and the transition.
Yeah, I mean, I remember reading your REIT lectures, which then were sort of the basis of the book that I know you've got another book we can talk about, but
don't have to.
but I mean, and the core of it is that idea, the disconnect between value and values, and the price of everything and the value of nothing. That old line. One of your examples, though, is we know the value of Amazon the company,
right,
and we don't properly capture the value of Amazon the rainforest. And despite the obvious value to the world, to the climate, to our environment, to the world, disclosure gets us part of the way there.
Only part of the way.
So
no.
How do you take that example, that simple example of Amazon? What policies should we be looking at to solve that problem?
Yeah, absolutely. And just to make the challenge greater, the price on the Amazon, the rainforest, actually occurs when the trees are cut down and they start farming. So it's the exact opposite direction of what the planet needs and what future generations deserve. So how do we solve that? I mean, first and foremost, this is about the translation of what people care about, people want, through the political process, and setting in place objectives, clear objectives, policies today, and the prospect of more policies in the future that are consistent with achieving those objectives, what the financial sector can do, what it does well, it does lots of things not well, just to be clear. And I've,
You've lived it.
I've lived it, and and people have lived the consequences of
for
that.
sure.
But we've spent time clearing up those messes. But what it does do well is it pulls the future to the present. It sees where the world is going, and then it will put money behind where the world's going. So if it becomes inevitable, or at least highly likely, that we're going to address this problem, then money starts to flow to those solutions. Okay. Now let's go to the specific major issue around nature and the Amazon specifically. So how do we get to a point where we ensure that there's not just disincentives to burn the Amazon, cut down the Amazon, and but also what's now needed is to reforest the Amazon. And let's put this in context for those who are still listening. So speaking to my my immediate family now, deforestation in the world last year was 10% of global emissions, just the mere act of cutting down trees. We lose the size of the Netherlands in effectively tropical rainforest, not all deforestation. So not including the wildfires, horrible wildfires we had in Canada, but just actually the harvesting of the tropical rainforest. So it's absolutely enormous. And so we need to stop that and then reverse it. And so one of the things that we're working on is with the Brazilian government and other governments around the world is how can we get payments for reforestation and the value to the planet of that reforestation.
Okay, pause there, because payments for reforestation make a lot of sense. I mean, I can imagine, because of the profile of the Amazon, I can imagine knocking doors and saying, we're going to deliver more dollars to international climate finance, and that's going to help make sure that we protect the Amazon, and that's the work we need to do as Canadians, as leaders around the world. I can also, though, imagine a world, because we've lived through it, where there's a Bolsonaro government in Brazil that doesn't care. I can imagine a world, because if the election was tomorrow, it might well be a Poilievre government that is going to not only cancel the price on pollution and an effective and efficient way of reducing emissions, climate disclosure might be by the wayside. Who knows? Who knows what they have in store, because climate is not part of their agenda. It's not a going concern. And how do you maintain that sense of optimism when we live in the political world that we do, and the political reality is that progress doesn't always exist. That voter might care in my riding and in certain ridings across the country, but collectively, with first past the post especially, we're going to wake up potentially to a majority government that doesn't have this on the agenda at all.
Well, okay, there's a lot in those questions / statements.
We have a progressive government that doesn't even deliver the climate finance internationally, at least, that is required to do the work you're even talking about. And that's a progressive government.
That's a progressive government.
So, the backsliding we're going to see is going to be incredible, given we're starting at a place that isn't even sufficient.
Okay, so let me unpack a few. I'm going to say a couple of rapid fire things, and then you can pick up on any of them to drill down. And full disclosure for those listening, there's a lot beneath what I'm about to say. The first is, in terms of payments for example, reforestation in the Amazon, my judgment is that is predominantly going to come from the private sector through something called the private voluntary credit market, and that is going to be a consequence of a number of major jurisdictions, hopefully Canada included, but certainly the European Union, the UK, most of Asia, depending on the U.S. outcome in the election, the United States as well, requiring companies to be reducing their emissions, including what's called Scope 3. Okay, so I said a lot there, but so a lot of it will come from that, and
jurisdictions like the EU forcing it upon others through carbon border adjustments and everything else.
Okay, so that's a next point. So very important point. Sorry, I talked over you, but carbon border adjustment mechanism, which Europe is putting in place, and I think underappreciated, the Biden administration has made pretty clear that they intend to put that in place. Obviously, it won't be the Biden administration. He's not running again. But if it were a Harris administration, I think it's reasonable to expect that. There's something called, this is in the public domain, the Climate and Trade Task Force. It's headed by John Podesta, who's one of the most able public servants in the U.S. government, and it's looking at what's called it's looking at a carbon border adjustment, and specifically how much carbon is in a product delivered to the United States. They use the term embodied carbon. So the issue is, if I'm exporting steel, how much carbon do I have in that steel that shows up in the United States? And if it's a lot higher than what's in the U.S., then they're not going to let it in. I mean, or they're going to have a very large tariff on it. Because after all, what they've been doing, and we've got to think about this for our industries, is huge efforts to get carbon down. And it doesn't make sense to do that and then just import all the carbon from China or some other jurisdiction. I think actually the Americans are going to go further, and the Europeans are going to go further in the following respect, which is not just to say how much carbon is in the steel that shows up here, but how much carbon is in all the steel you produce as that company. Because we don't want you just dumping the green steel over here and then polluting over there.
Right.
And that's a fairer way of doing things for the U.S. company, and let's keep it close to home for the Canadian company. So we're going to quickly move, I think, over the course of the next 5-10 years, certainly over the horizon when any business decision is being made, to a global trading system, or the core of the global trading system, Europe, the U.S., under certain political circumstances. But I would argue, if not the next administration, the administration after that will do this. We're going to move to a system where it matters how much carbon you have in your product when you export it there. Now, fast forward to the next Canadian government after the next election. So are they just going to walk away from that reality? We're a trading nation. We're an exporting nation. This is our most important market. I mean, you can live in a fantasy land and say this doesn't matter, and it's all about the other guys. But that is not the way the world works and is going to work. And one of the things we've talked about this, and it's part of the reason I'm doing this growth task force, which we may come to for the Prime Minister, is that the world's being reshaped. The trading system is being reshaped. That creates challenges, massive challenges if you ignore it. Flip side, massive opportunities if you understand it, get in front of it, and start to embrace it. And, Canada's in a good position, or we can be in a great position to take advantage of this. I
mean, one might have, though, expressed a certain optimism around markets and the market that Ontario was in with Quebec and California, for example. Yes. Then they walked away from it. So politics does matter. So I want to get to politics.
Without question.
And one can be optimistic, and market forces matter, and the EU's actions matter, and one can be optimistic for certain reasons. But there's a reason to get involved in politics, to make sure you push back against the backsliding and to make sure you protect progress. You have gone from a role where you were political but divorced from partisan politics as the central bank governor, both in Canada and in England. You, in 2021, I think, spoke for the first time in a more partisan way at Liberal Convention. You're occupying a more partisan role, giving you're the chair of an economic task force for the party and the Prime Minister, but again, a partisan front, not the machinery of government. Why you've got you're making money at Brookfield. You've got your UN envoy role. Yeah. You don't need to throw yourself into the Pierre Poilievre attacks and the Michael Barrett saying conflict this and carbon tax Carney. And why insert yourself in this way now?
I could ask you the same question.
Yeah,
and all the people
fair.
Work for it, which is there's a couple levels of it. I mean, there's the personal level, which this country has given me so much, virtually everything. I think when I think about it, my education, my values, I've raised my family here. I owe it a lot. I've been very fortunate. Yeah. So, and I can give back. And there's certain things I can do to give back. And I happen to know something about economic policy. I happen to have some experience. I've got some perspective. I can give it back. That's the first thing. And, I could stop there, but it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, is this gap between value in the market and the values of Canadians, the values of society, what we're trying to achieve. there are certain technical things, and they're really important. They're super boring, which is why you're rightly diverted off the PRI in person. They're super boring and they're plumbing, et cetera. And I know something about that, and I work in it. It's, and it's value. Just trust me. It's useful work. Okay. It's useful work. But at the heart is getting the heart is political in the end, because it is translating, it's building coalitions, it's listening to people.
Yeah, of course.
It's developing the consensus, it's fighting it out in the House of Commons, in committees, in order to get legislation through and move forward. And, it can be frustrating, and it would be much easier for me to just sit back and criticize about this. But I've got some expertise. Prime Minister's asked. We need to close this gap. I think it's the right thing to do for Canadians, because it's living up to what Canadians say they want. It's certainly the right thing to do for our kids and grandkids. But also, as time goes on, it becomes more and more an economic imperative. It becomes more and more current, an issue in terms of how fast is this economy going to grow? Are people's wages going to grow? Are we going to lose a lot of jobs that we shouldn't lose, or not create new jobs that we could create because we think that this is an issue for other people? It's not an issue for other people. It's an issue for all of us.
When it comes to politics, I am not running again solely because I've got a young family. I still think elected office, for all of its faults, and there are many faults, there's a lot of nonsense to it if you watch Question Period or the House of Commons, but it's still the most important way to make a difference, bar none. Having said that, everything you said there gets at that sort of the man in the arena sort of idea, and an opportunity to make a difference. I believe in all that. There's a difference, though, between giving advice and being a decision maker. And are you going to put your name on a ballot at some point?
Well, I mean, I'm taking steps to that support the party, because I believe in the party. I believe in the Liberal Party. I think it's got the right values. It has the right combination of a social conscience and social priorities at its core, and that's a demonstrated. It's not. These aren't words on a page. It's demonstrated through decades of delivery and the past years of delivery. So it has at its core, but it also understands that we need a strong economy in order to ultimately deliver that. So I absolutely believe in that. And look, the opportunity may present itself. This is what I can do right now, and I'm doing it to the best of my ability.
And do you think, when you think of politics, I mean, you have occupied positions of great power in really difficult crises, and there isn't that same grinding it out, knocking doors, engaging people who are, the example I use is you got to be able to go downtown and have Bay Street with my friends from law school. You could do that in a heartbeat, but you also got to be able to go play cards and drink Ryan Cokes with my cousins from Sarnia. And do you see yourself being able to do both?
Well, I used to drink Ryan 7. So am I allowed to have Ryan 7?
Yeah, that's allowed. That's okay. That's allowed.
Sorry, yeah.
I don't know. You smoke joints. You can do that too.
That's true. You can now. Thank you. There's progress.
Yeah, I know. You're welcome.
Look, I mean, that's I've been in and around it. I recognize that. I mean, you've got to be connected to the people you serve. And one of the issues, look, it's also an issue. It's not fully analogous. I'm not going to stretch it to that. But even in a role like being a central bank governor, if you're just in the monetary temple, so to speak, and you're not out there talking to people up and down the country, which the Bank of Canada does. I did as governor. Governor Dodge did before me, and I know the current governor, my successors both have done it. I did in the UK. You've got to get out there and talk to people, and it's not just businesses, but social groups, other groups, to understand how the macro economy, the numbers way up there, are actually impacting people for accountability, but also for perspective. And there's something that was impressed on me decades ago, I guess, was that you see most clearly from the periphery. So when you look at the economy, how does the economy look if you're unemployed? How does the situations where you're under pressure, and that provides a necessary grounding to everything you do. But yeah, you've got to do that, and you've got to build consensus, and you have to work. Look, let's take another level of this, if I could.
Yeah, sure.
Which is one of the issues. So, okay, we have a mini industry in Canada which has grown up around that we don't have any productivity. Or we've the productivity or the rate with which we're improving the way we work has slowed. It's basically been flatlined since before the pandemic. Ultimately, that is going to put pressure, and it's starting to put pressure on governments, all levels of governments, and the ability to continue to provide the social safety net, our social model, opportunities for children, our education system, all those things. So this is an issue we have to solve. We can certainly solve, and not that there's going to be some magical report at the end of my task force work. I mean, there will be a report. I'm not going to say it's magical.
We'll get to that.
But there will be elements of that in there. But one of the things I think is clear is that the nature of many of the solutions will require something that's fundamentally political. Which is political in terms of working across different levels of government, different stakeholders to implement solutions. And we're going to have to do more of that or relearn that muscle, which is, in my experience, is kind of inherent to the Federation and maybe has weakened a bit.
Well, I want to get to what you see as the objectives and what you see as the possible outcomes, what you hope to achieve through that task force and your involvement in all of that. But I'm still interested in, I like that you're interested in politics. I like that good people are interested in politics. I think it's necessary that serious people are still interested in doing this. And I worry that when you've got a certain crass attack before anything else approach to politics, you push good people out. Why are good people want to get off the sidelines and do this if you're going to join committee in 2021, which you did at the industry committee that I was a part of, and I had a front row seat to Pierre-Paul even before he was the leader. He was the only Conservative to speak for that 2 hours of time, and just try and run roughshod over you, knowing that you might be in politics one day. That's the approach. It's take no prisoners. So I'm glad you're interested. At the same time, there are some challenges that will be thrown your way, and I'm interested sort of how you navigate them. So you've got, on the one hand, a politicization of the Bank of Canada with Pierre Poilievre saying Tiff Macklem should be fired. You've got other folks, though, like Stephen Gordon, who have said, well, Mark Carney, he was the central bank governor. If he joins partisan politics, then that also puts some independence of that institution at risk. Do you take stock of that in any way? What's your answer to that?
Well, I think a couple of things. I think my track record at Bank Canada, others can judge it, but inflation was at 2%. Our financial system was the strongest in the world.
Got through a crisis.
Financial stability. We got through crises. Got through a few crises. I'd note that I was appointed by Stephen Harper as governor of the Bank of Canada. Then I was appointed by a Conservative Prime Minister in the United Kingdom, David Cameron, and then I was asked to extend my term by a Conservative Prime Minister, Theresa May, and a Conservative Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. And in all of those cases, I discharged, did to the best of my ability, did my job. I ceased to be governor of the Bank of Canada in 2013. We are 11 years later. We've been through a few governors. The world has changed. Look, I mean, if we were in a situation where the stakes weren't so high, in part because of the start of your question, in part because of the unseriousness of some of those in public life. I mean, it's serious, but the facile,
serious what's at stake, but as a childish approach to it,
the approach to it is facile is probably is a euphemism. So I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, it's incredibly polite.
To describe the approach that's taken. It's not trying to find solutions. It's trying to destroy and cut down. And who knows what comes after that? It's not clear what comes after that. So the stakes are high. So that pulls me towards trying to be part of it, because this is, it's our country, it's my country, and I care about it, and so wanting to be there. I think the thing though that's in your question, as someone who's been through crises, who lived through Brexit and the intense, everything was politicized
of
in
course.
Brexit in the UK. The king, the now king, was politicized. The Archbishop of Canterbury, the head of the Church of England, was politicized. The governor of the Bank of England was politicized. In other words, we were all attacked in various ways by various factions. Well, from one faction, I guess, on the referendum, and many, many others. Everything, basically. So I know what I'd be getting into. I know what I'm in. Look, I'm in it now in the following respect. As you said, in 2021, I'm a private citizen. I'm invited to a committee.
Getting grilled for
and
no
I get grilled. Well, not grilled. I don't mind being grilled, but just getting, sort of insulted,
attacks, yeah.
ad hominem
Yeah.
attacks, basically being insulted. And four other expert witnesses have to sit there mute
and just watch it. Yeah.
and just watch it for 2.5 hours. I mean, that's a waste of taxpayers' money. It's a waste of time. It's not advancing the cause. And so I know what's involved.
So you're ready.
I've
Like
seen it.
you're ready to put up with that absolute nonsense when it comes. Like right now, you're living through people attacking you to say, "Oh, he's no." I mean, Andrew Scheer. I love that Andrew Scheer is the spokesperson they put up, as if anyone likes Andrew Scheer. But Andrew Scheer is saying, "Oh, there's no difference between Trudeau and Carney, carbon tax Carney," and like you are the object of their attention as much as anyone, and probably because they're worried about you, but also there is you are gonna put up with an incredible amount of hate and an incredible, look what the Trudeau's got to put up with fuck Trudeau flags. And his kids have to listen to fuck Trudeau chants at Ultimate Fight events. So you're ready for that?
Look, yes is the short answer. I think this is an overused phrase. We're better than that. Canada's better than that. We should be better than that. But you've got to stand up. I mean, if you think that, you act it. You stand up. You stood up for the Ontario leadership. I mean, these are difficult.
You'll come in with more name recognition than I did. I will say that. Well, are you also ready? So. I think your name recognition will.
I'm really touched by your concern about my welfare.
It's not for the faint of heart, that's for sure, especially in a leadership role. And they'll come at you with everything, as you've already seen. They're coming at you as a citizen. The other challenge you will have to navigate if you get there is every time your name comes up. Like I'm at the I'm here in the beaches and. People will come up and say, "Oh, what about that Carney guy? Is he going to run?" And so there's obviously an interest. At the same time, there will be another cohort, often people in the Liberal Party who have lived the wars, who will say, "Yeah, but what about Michael Ignatieff?" And the comparison comes up all the time. Why? Because intellectual, someone who has not lived through partisan politics throughout a career and is coming to it as an intellectual who's earned a reputation as an intellectual. And do you see that comparison? Are you concerned with that comparison? And how do you answer that comparison?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. One is we don't want to restrict politics only to lifelong politicians,
I hope not,
right? I mean, that's first and foremost.
Having done it for 10 years, I will also say I hope we don't limit it.
Understand, right? And you're going to go off and do something else for a while. Hopefully, you'll come back into political life. Maybe you won't. Maybe you will have served that tenure. Who
knows?
But we'll see. But so we don't. I don't think there's. I'm not casting aspersions on people who are lifelong politicians. Although, if somebody's a lifelong politician and they're talking about, for example, as only someone like Pierre Poilievre, who's been a lifelong politician, talks about the market in a way and the economy in a way that betrays very limited understanding of how the economy actually works, undervalues institutions, undervalues people, doesn't know this relationship.
I like when he talks about
value
electricians and lightning, personally.
Capture. There's a few things they doesn't understand. So that's the first thing. So I don't think this is a sort of simple, you're ruled out unless you've gone through the school of politics. That's number one. Number two, I think with respect to Michael Ignatieff, I've been in the I've been as close to the political arena as you can.
Right.
I have been a public figure through crises in Canada, elsewhere around the world. I've been there for making tough decisions. I've worked with a variety of governments. I've been in and around. Look, I know how to deal with tough issues and not just talk about them, but implement and get things done. So, we'll take where we started today. This discussion on climate change and what's going on in climate change. 3 years ago, there were $5 trillion of money managed by financial institutions that was going to be managed towards net zero. Today, there's 150 trillion. 150 trillion. That is 70 times larger than the Canadian economy. I helped marshal that. I chair the group that put that together. I know how to get things done. I have a track record. So I have experience in working with a wide variety of stakeholders across different geographies, countries, continents, political classes. As I mentioned earlier, I've been appointed by the Conservatives, and so that brings something to the table. Does it answer every question? But
no, it does.
Look, and Michael Ignatieff is a better intellectual than I am. I mean, I do not.
I think it comes down to connecting with people, and you mentioned it before we started recording. Just everything. I forget exactly how you phrased it, but sort of everything is about authenticity, because there's no perfect candidate, and not everyone's going to see everything about themselves in any particular candidate. I was struck. I did my Master of Laws in the UK at Oxford, and my wife was there doing her Master of Nutrition at Oxford Brookes, and we visited the Imperial War Museum in London, and there was a genocide exhibit at the time. And I was like, I recognize that voice. And there's a film of Michael Ignatieff in a Jeep.
Oh, it's Blood and Belonging, probably, right?
Right. And he in some ways ran away from that. That it was Michael's just visiting, and there was no answer to say, you're damn right, I've been overseas. I've been a Canadian. Overseas being as Canadians act. We deliver for the world. We act in the best interest of people around the world. And I've been out there addressing genocide. I've been out there speaking about human rights. Like, I'm proud of that record, and I'm coming back to Canada to make sure I deliver on those values as a leader here in Canada for Canadians. I think it was a disservice to be skittish about that record, and you don't have the same challenge in that you've had a high-profile position here in Canada. You are now entering into partisan politics in a you're not jumping right to a leadership position. You're playing. I don't know if you have a view.
I'm in the trenches.
Well, one question I would have is: do you see a value in elected office as a backbencher or as an MP before a higher profile role?
I mean, you can't map these things out. Of course, there's value in that. But let me pick up something popped into my head while you were using that example. So one of the knocks on me that the opposition makes, or part of the opposition
makes. A WEF global elite.
Exactly. I'm a WEF global elite.
John Barrett is too, but I don't know. Campaign coach here, that never comes up. When he's banned his ministers from going to World Economic Forum events to cater to conspiracies, and you've been a board member for over a decade.
I've rolled off the board, but that's absolutely right. I had a board member there, and I used to go there with Prime Minister Stephen Harper when he was there, and etc. But let's be clear what my international experience. I understand how the world works. I know other world leaders. I know people and understand. I know people who run some of the world's largest companies and understand how they work. I know how financial institutions work. I know how markets work. I know the good and bad of that. I've experienced it. I've had to, in some of my roles, discipline the financial system, discipline with others, the world's largest banks, the Wall Street banks in America after the crisis. So I understand how the world works. I'm trying to apply that to the benefit of Canada. So I'm not going to run away from the fact that I understand how things work. And actually, one of the things that has drawn me more into politics right now is that we have an opposition who's leading in the polls, who doesn't understand the economy, doesn't understand where the world's going, doesn't understand what's necessary to build this economy for Canadians, who thinks it's a series of simplistic slogans. There's nothing behind those slogans. There's nothing behind those slogans. I've had plenty of opportunity after this podcast comes out to release, some platforms behind those slogans. They won't. Yeah. And that is a massive risk. That is a massive risk. Doing nothing is a choice. Pretending we're in the economy of the 1980s and 1990s, that is a huge, huge mistake. And the other jurisdictions are moving. I understand that. I can contribute part of that. We've got to do it in a way that is socially inclusive, that brings Canadians along, that supports people through these big transitions. And we can do it in a way that really wins if we're deliberate about it. But if we shut all that out, we're going to lose.
Well, it's a useful turn then to the role that you now occupy to chair this economic task force. You are in a position now, principally, we've got a fall economic statement, we've got a budget, but principally, as I understand the role, it's also to inform, if we have an election in the spring, in a perfect world, it might last all the way to October, but that seems unlikely these days. You've got one version of the cartoonish slogans. You've got a debate in Parliament right now where the Bloc is saying we demand support for $16 billion over 5 years to a poorly targeted and expensive program. Seems an ineffective way of using a taxpayer dollar we don't have right now. I don't want you to be so prescriptive about here are all the answers. I've got all the answers. This is the platform today because you're at the beginning of it. But where, if put it this way, in 2021, you said we need a growth agenda and this budget isn't delivering all of that, but it's the beginnings of it, and it's going to take a number of budgets to get us to where we are. Well, we're a number of budgets in,
right?
And I was at the Canada 2020 speech where you were talking about, sounded like a third way almost. You've got government spending, you've got cuts, and you were talking about a little bit of a different path as between them. Articulate what, and not at such a high level maybe, but articulate, and maybe there are examples you could point to of what we can expect to see in the advice you're giving and the approach that you hope the government takes hold of into the next election.
Yeah, let me, again, these are great questions and there's a lot in them. Let me make a couple of observations, and I noted your comments not because I was coming on this. I just happened to catch them in the last 10 days or so about that Bloc proposal and the fact that all the opposition parties supported it.
Yeah, it's wild.
It's wild. So an extra $3 billion of spending each year, and is that really the best use of that money? And what came to my mind instantly, and I think you observed it as well, is that in the simple slogan category, Pierre Poilievre is a simple rule: $1 for $1.
Yeah, spend a dollar, more cut spending, a dollar.
Cut a dollar.
Yeah.
So what are the $3 billion of spending cuts that he's going to make? If you're going to put up new spending and you have that rule, you've got to show Canadians what's there. Okay. But let's talk about the growth issues in Canada. So how do we get growth back up? And let me put it in context, which is if the Canadian economy were as productive as the American economy, so if we we used all our resources so to speak as efficiently as the American economy, if we close that gap, which is about 30% with the US, it's an additional 35,000 Canadian dollars for every Canadian. So it's a huge amount of money. That's money that goes obviously for government, for social programs. We can invest in our health service, not rely on compound increases in foreign students in order to pay for our post-secondary education, all these sorts of things. So there's real value in doing this. It also means much higher wages for Canadians by definition. So why are we less productive? Which things can we change in order to close some of that gap? And where can we build on our advantage, our unique advantages? And that's basically what I'm looking at with others through this task force. And so one of the core things in terms of why we're less productive is we actually give our workers less to work with. There's less so-called capital, there's less software, there's less investment fewer tools, so to speak, for our workers. It's like shoveling your driveway with a shovel,
And it's business
versus
investment.
a snowblower. It's business investment, yeah. And you have to, when you look at outside of the resource sector, we just don't invest in much in our workers. We also don't use those tools as effectively as others do. So it's also kind of how we work. Okay.
You talk about frameworks. So just on that though, and I'm interested in the rest of what you got there, but you talk about the need for frameworks and the importance of a plan and a framework to deliver. What is the difference when you look at American companies that do invest in their workers to a much higher degree than Canadian companies invest in their workers? Is there a policy framework that explains the difference? What explains that difference?
Well, so this is part of the challenge, which is there's no one magical change to the tax system or one regulation that you adjust that is going to instantly, right this or start to close the gap. And you have to look across a series of options in order to get there.
But this will be a core focus.
But that is going to be a core focus. The element of the diagnosis of the problem needs to look at part of it. Fundamentally is about underinvestment. Why is that the case? How can we change it? Part of it is about the industries that we have. Where have we built up and what haven't we built up? But to use that overused analogy, also where is the puck going? If the world is going to be moving to lower carbon, which parts of that transition can we lead? In fact, can we dominate in? Also, how are we going to apply AI? I mean, this is one of the world's leader in AI. We just had a Canadian win the Nobel Prize, Geoffrey Hinton. I mean, amazing, and his impact in this country and the AI ecosystem has been absolutely enormous. We can build off of that in so many different ways. The companies themselves, how we use AI for all, not just use AI to displace workers. That's what we don't want to do. We want to use AI to give people more tools to have better jobs and be more productive and do that. So there's lots of things that we can do with that. So it shifts from the overall, why do we invest not as much? Why do we not use the tools as well? But then we'll go to which parts of the economy can we build up, and which are the elements that make all of the economy more productive. So can I be a little more specific about this? Yeah. Okay.
Specifics are good in politics.
Specifics are always good. Okay. So, previous Prime Minister, Prime Minister Harper, wanted Canada to be an energy superpower. And in many respects, we are, because we have hydro, we have oil and gas, we have nuclear, etc. We need to be a clean energy superpower. That's where the world's going. That means a couple of things. So there's certain things, my point, which I should have started with, is there's certain things that can make all of the economy better, all of the economy more productive, can help close the gap.
Cleaner, cheaper power is an example.
Cleaner, cheaper power across Canada is good for Canadians. It's good for Canadian jobs. It is great for Canadian manufacturing, because companies around the world, as the world's being rewired, are looking for low-risk jurisdictions. We're about as risk-free as anyone can be, with trade access to the biggest markets. We've got the best trade relationships of anybody, and who have clean power. That is ever more the case in the new industries on technology, the so-called hyperscalers, the big technology companies. They are looking to build out data centers and computing in jurisdictions outside of the United States where they can trust, but they have to have clean power. So we have to take our natural advantages in clean power and grow them quickly. But let's do that in a way that benefits Canadians above and beyond just having those data centers come and built here by, let's Google or Meta or Microsoft or whoever. We want to make sure that a portion of those data centers is available for our companies, the companies that Geoffrey Hinton helped spawn, the Coheres of this world, if you will. And as well, we want to make sure that Canadians are learning how to use these tools to solve problems for the world, whether it's protein folding in life sciences. By the way, another Nobel Prize we're recording today, Demis Hassabis won the Nobel Prize for that.
Okay.
And we have the capability of building that out. So we build out the ecosystem around that. Then you take a step back and say, and there's every reason why we should. The great universities here in Toronto, in Alberta, in Montreal, et cetera, that are building this expertise, the Creative Destruction Lab just down the street here, all of that is part of, I'm sorry to use the word ecosystem, but it's relevant to how we can build this out at scale. What else do we need to do to incentivize and reward the builders of that economy?
And you said
builders, so you work your way back from that.
I'm curious. I haven't read Hinge. It's not out yet, but this is your new book.
It's not written.
It's not written. Okay. Well, I saw an announcement around it.
It's large. I mean, it's not finished. Sorry, my publisher is listening. It's not perfected.
I like that. That's good. So, in some summary that I read, though, whether you wrote it or not, maybe the publisher wrote it, it does talk about it being time to build. But but what I found interesting about the knock-on language was not just governments. This isn't just about governments putting public capital in to build. This is about encouraging the private sector to invest in things that also are going to create long-lasting value to our country. It's one thing to say we want businesses to invest in workers, and that's a priority. But when we talk about building things, and I wish we were waking up 10 years after the Liberal government was elected in 2015 and we had high-speed rail between Toronto and Montreal. We don't have that, unfortunately. I mean, there is high-frequency rail, maybe high-speed.
With a spur to Ottawa.
Maybe it's coming. I don't know.
And between Edmonton and Calgary.
But when you say it's time, do you have something in mind of what building this country up looks like?
Without question. Look, and I'm glad you raise it, because where we are around the world is we are at the start of an investment era. I could call it an investment boom, but an investment era. Let me use an example from the European Union. Mario Draghi, central banker, became a prime minister, just did analysis.
You should use that example.
I threw it in. It took me a while. Just did a very comprehensive analysis for the European Union and where do they go in their next phase of their growth strategy. One of the things that's striking is their analysis is that the scale of investment that Europe needs to do for the net zero transition and the AI transformation or revolution, depending on how you frame it, plus a bit on security, is twice the size of the Marshall Plan, which was put in place after World War II to rebuild an absolutely destroyed Europe. So it's 5 percentage points in his estimation of GDP in additional investment year in, year out for decades. Okay. We have probably not quite that level, but something similar. That is building. That is an enormous opportunity for this country, because the actual act of building clean energy, the act of building out the computing power for AI, the act of investing in skills, all of that is growth at the time. But what it will do if we do it right, it will lock in competitive advantage for our companies and futures for Canadians and their children in the industries of the future. And because both being low carbon and deploying machine learning, artificial intelligence are generalized drivers of competitiveness, in other words, across a bunch of industries. You don't have to be working in AI to get the benefit of it. Right. If we do this right. You can be manufacturing or, in the resource sector, but if you're low carbon, you will have access to those markers. We talked earlier about CBAM. So how do we get ahead of that and how do we build? So it's absolutely a time to build. You had Lisa Raitt on the podcast a few weeks ago. Yeah. And she, with Don Iveson, did great work on this housing report. Mike Moffat was part of it. Others, I was a small part of the group. We need to build a lot of houses. Okay. We all know that. There is a smart way to do that. There's an effective way to do that. There's a way that builds a Canadian industry and Canadian expertise on next generation, energy efficient and livable housing that can build a real industry in this country, above and beyond provide the needs for that. And at the core of their report is that strategy. We have taken, I think, as a country, components of that strategy, the more immediate components, but not fully drawn through the recommendations. It's time to build. We should pull that through, because we don't just get the benefit of, and I mean, look, it's an imperative. It's not a benefit. It's an imperative of building these houses, somewhere between 5 to 8 million additional houses.
We're well short at the moment.
Yeah, we're well short. So we know, we'll worry about whether it's 5 or 8, several years down the line. But let's do it in a way that builds an industry that, Canada can export around the world.
I've got a question around fairness, but before I get there, just on the productivity question, do you worry about, you've got, I think it's something like 75% of consumer debt is tied up in mortgages. You've got 50% of the bank balance sheet is mortgages. You've got, when you look at the percentage of our economy that is premised on real estate, and we're not just talking about building new houses at that point, which is productive use of capital. In many cases, it's acquiring an existing asset, and it's not the most productive use of a dollar in Canadian society. Do you worry about just how much we have invested as a country in the real estate sector?
Look, I certainly had jobs where I
had to worry about that.
And that was the second nature of that. I think the following, which is that we're in a position where we are very short housing, and we have a responsibility, all of us, whether we're in government or those who are in the sector, in the private sector, and particularly it's all levels of government, to solve that problem, to make sure that every Canadian resident has a decent place to live, that it's affordable, that they can manage it. We can grow our way into that situation. It's natural that, the separate point or related point, it's natural that people, their biggest asset is their home.
Of course.
And, their biggest liability is their mortgage. That's natural. If everyone waited until they could buy their home for cash,
no one would own a home.
No one would own a home.
But it does strike me, pushing investment dollars into building, and again, what the framework is, we want to push any new dollar that's coming into the housing space. We want to get new housing built, as opposed to competing with first-time home buyers for residential resales, for example.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, we need to build a lot of homes, and that has implications for building standards, codes, permitting, the way we build those homes. It would be a huge missed opportunity if we build the homes of yesterday for the world of today, and a world where, again, in Lisa's and Don's report, they quite rightly make this point that, the risks from a changing climate change the specifications of and the locations of where you should build. And, the efficiency of greater density in our cities is look, it's great for neighborhoods. I mean, we've got a great mixed, this is one of the classic neighborhoods, great neighborhoods in the world, let alone Canada. But more of that infill density is valuable if you do it the right way.
Yeah. Well, your focus on this task force is growth, productivity, but you have also written a good deal about inclusive growth. You have written that we have to be more honest with people about winners and losers when it comes to trade and technological transformation. And then the idea behind inclusive growth is to make sure we support people along the way. And there's an underlying sense of fairness to it. And when you look at the Canadian context, when you look at the work you're going to do with this task force, how much does inclusive growth factor into it? And how would you articulate, I'm not going to knock on doors and talk about inclusive growth. I don't think that is a doorstep way of talking about it, but helping people in need and helping people who are struggling and helping make sure we're addressing cost of living, that sounds like what we're trying to drive at when we talk about inclusive growth. What do you mean when you talk about it?
Yeah, I agree with everything you said. I would frame it a bit this way, if I could, which is it gets us substantially the way there towards an inclusive society, but not all of the way there to an inclusive society. And by which I mean, there's ways to grow that recognize that you're going to have, it's an ugly word, but it's an ugly process where you're going to have big churn in firms, in industries, and therefore in jobs. So new jobs will be created, but old jobs will be lost. And the question is, what happens to the people in those jobs? Are they ready for the new jobs? How do you get them ready for the new jobs? And look, the lesson of previous industrial revolutions, and we are entering two industrial revolutions at the same time, the sustainable revolution and the AI revolution. The lesson of previous industrial revolutions is what happens is that you go through a long period with huge change of jobs and industries, and that workers are slow to benefit from the benefits of those new industries. Now, that doesn't have to be the case, and what happens is that eventually people get retrained. Eventually, new social safety net and welfare systems are put in place to support people, but it happens decades after the fact. The political process lags. I think we should benefit from that knowledge, that history, and do this in real time. Yeah. And it therefore has to be part and parcel of the growth strategy. So a huge element of this is necessarily going to have to be around the skills agenda, and the skills agenda in real time, and make these changes not threatening for people, but legitimately exciting for people, because they have the opportunity to develop the skills that, you know, are in the clean economy, are applying AI across a huge range of those economies, and they're growing their jobs from there. And that means, you know, it means multiple levels of government, as you can appreciate, because the skills is not unique to any level of government. And it means being coordinated with industry. It means coordinated with other stakeholders. And I think it also means, and this is, I don't think I'll draw this out in the report, but it's a broader question. You've thought about this is, well, what does it mean for social welfare and support? Because ideally, look, what's happening, not ideally what's happening, but what is likely to happen is, you know, you have people in their 30s or 40s, and the industry is changing, and they have an opportunity to shift into a new role. But ideally, this is where the ideal is, they have a partner, you know, they have a mortgage because they have a place to live. Maybe they have children as well. So they have obligations. So how easy is it for them to then take a year out or time out to develop those new skills?
Social support.
Yeah, and how do you integrate the both the social welfare system with that, or the social support for that, as well as make sure you have real places, real opportunity to get that training. Yeah, and we need to be thinking about that right now.
Yesterday, because apart from any transformation which you're getting at, you have 1.5 million people that don't have a job right now. Yeah. And there's got to be an overriding focus on supporting people through the social safety net where they are unable to work, and helping people, properly supporting them, not get off your ASS approach of Doug Ford, which is I don't even know what decade to accuse him from being from, but actually supporting people with that skills training, that education, and those social supports on the income side. The other question on fairness, and I did ask you this, a version of this at least, when you gave that speech, and then no one was putting up their hand, and I was like, all right, I'll ask Mark Carney a question. I'm not shy about asking questions, and I put it this way. And I'll give you a second crack at it, because you
really liked my first answer.
Your first answer left a little to be desired, I would say. So when you have spoken about income inequality, but you then have highlighted rightly that income inequality is sizably outpaced by wealth inequality. And there are challenging ways of tackling this problem, but before we get to the tackling of the problem, just so people who are listening understand this, StatsCan measures this in different ways. Social Capital Partners, and this is what I referenced in my preamble to the question previously, but they estimate that the top 1% owns 25% of the wealth in Canada, and the top 0.1% owns 13% of the wealth. And it's an incredible amount of inequality when you think about the scale of it all, and especially when you contrast that as against the insignificant disability benefit and the number of people who are truly in need in society. And so when we have that, I think everything through the lens of a fair and productive economy. You're focused on the productive end of it, but when we talk about inclusive growth, when we think of inequalities like wealth inequality, fairness looms large. How do you think we can best address this? Now, the capital gains changes, I'm curious if you have a comment on that, because I think those were a very useful step forward in addressing wealth inequality. As the OECD has highlighted personal capital income taxes as the most effective path forward in terms of tackling this problem because of capital flight risks with other changes, potential changes with net wealth taxes. How would you best address that question of wealth inequality?
Well, I think the following, and this is where the trade-off comes, and this is where the political system comes together in order to make the judgments around those trade-offs. Because we're in a position where it's a time to build, right? Time to build out the housing, the industries of the future, get the economy growing, and increase income and wealth for all Canadians.
Yep.
And for that to happen, and I'm going to come to your question, but I want to pick up on something you mentioned earlier, which I didn't really highlight, which is, and you referenced it as a third way, as opposed to, spend and subsidize and support, or, cut our way to prosperity, the destroy, deny type approach, demolish approach. And that's a way that is clear through a political process about what we're trying to accomplish. The missions, if you will, of the government. Are we trying to become a clean energy superpower? Are we trying to become the essential trading partner of our friends, et cetera, et cetera? What are we trying to do in order to create that well? And then how do we go about it? And how we go about it, the role of government in that respect is partly through policy, present and future, partly through regulation, smart regulation, in fact, not too many, but smart regulation standards, and sometimes through a bit of capital investment themselves, is to catalyze a huge amount of private investment. That's what's necessary. And because the orders of magnitude are so large that, no government can or should try to take it on. In order to get that last component, the private investment, we need builders. We need companies and individuals and entrepreneurs and people to figure out better, not just to invest, but also figure out better ways to accomplish the goals that we've set as a society. And they need to be rewarded, right? I mean, they're going to do it in part to be rewarded. So they are going to create wealth. They're going to create wealth for the country as a whole, but also they're going to have some of that. And so the judgment is around what's the right reward and how do you balance that with how much of the wealth that's created, the total wealth that's created, that is captured by society. Do we capture it in general in the economy, and we tax the economy in general, or do we go and tax at that source, so to speak? And the thing I'll be candid, what I didn't like about the capital gains discussion earlier this year was the way it was framed, the way it was toned. It was kind of class warfare type language, which, well, as if we're entering an era where if we're going to be successful, we need some people, some companies, some Canadians to be successful, and that doesn't mean they're bad people, that they've done the wrong thing. In fact, they will have done what we want them to do if we have a clean tech entrepreneur, carbon capture, those people, and they get to scale. If a Canadian company is the world leader in small modular reactors, for example, which is necessary for so many solutions around the world, actually, we do want them to see some again. They're not bad people. They're good people. They're part of what we need to do. So then, how do we balance that? And how do we balance it through overall levels of taxation of income on the way up, And do we have some form of is it around capital gains? Do we have capital gains at the right level now? Capital
And
gains
is there a way to
taxation?
distinguish at times between active and passive income? Because, take housing as the classic example. But if you've got, and I mentioned this example earlier, but if you've got dollars coming in to build, I want to incentivize that every chance I get. More dollars coming in to build, but I want to disincentivize, if anything, dollars coming in to compete with first-time home buyers in the residential resale space. That's not productive capital in the same way. And you could have a tax regime that treats
you can have a tax regime
differently.
And you can have and we do have some of this, which is you can have other elements of the regime which support the first-time home buyer, which tilts the playing field that way. Yeah. So these are look, these are all crucial things. I used the term earlier, the adjective earlier. It's not going to be a magical report. It's not going to be a magical.
It doesn't sound like you're going to address extreme wealth inequality, but you are addressing productivity
but
squarely.
but you've got to address. Yeah, you've got to address how are we going to grow this economy? How are we best going to grow this economy? And in part, how are we going to grow this economy in a way that puts people first and brings as many Canadians along as possible in that growth, in and of that self, in that growth, in the dignity of a job and a career and flourishing in Canada.
I think that's all right.
But above and beyond that, there is these questions which you're rightly raising, which is, okay, but there's no perfect growth strategy that lifts absolutely all boats. Right. That's absolute. We've lived through that.
And we've just delivered after. So here's you didn't live through this in the same way I did, but we just promised people with disabilities, like we set an expectation here.
Right.
We delivered this. And it's not nothing. It's like effectively $1 billion plus a year. Works out, I think, 1.2, 1.3 on an ongoing basis, but it pales in comparison. I mean, we're now having a debate about $3 billion in new spending for old age security, which is poorly targeted when you're talking about, a senior that makes $120,000 in a given year is going to earn, their taxable benefits, but would receive $4,000 in benefits. That doesn't stack up when I look at who are we, what is inclusive growth? How are we going to help people and make sure people aren't left behind? And I do think as we think about productivity and growth, and that's your overriding objective, and rightly so, there does have to be this knock-on consideration to say, okay, well, I don't see this skills training and this AI transformation necessarily benefiting someone who's really struggling, who has a disability and is on this support. So how do we make sure we do both at the same time? And we deliver the growth we need, but we also have, we also promise to expand that disability benefit.
But that's why, and you talked earlier about why am I involved working with the Liberal Party, working for the Prime Minister on this? Yeah. But that's because both questions get asked, and both questions are looked at, be answered. So the growth element and the social element, the broader social, as opposed to growth, the be-all and end-all. But we are in a position now, as I think other economies, the UK, the EU, the US, has a different weighting of these issues. But certainly those other economies that have a similar, not exactly the same, but a similar set of values, a similar set of balance between equality of opportunity, equality of outcome, and fairness across generations. Those three big factors. Different societies weight those differently. I think we, as Canadians, try to balance across all three as much as possible. But we're in a situation, as is the UK, as is the EU, where our ability to meet all of those will be compromised unless we solve the growth equation. Okay, we have to solve this. It does not follow that by solving the growth equation, we solve all these other things, because we then have to make choices of what do we do with that growth? What do we do with the fruits of that growth?
Redistribution is still part of the conversation.
That bring all Canadians along.
I think you talk about is redistribution and regeneration, but you need both.
We need both.
Look, I appreciate the time. When you are... when you're ready to beat Kevin Wong in Spadina Harbourfront, I'm there to canvass for you. Okay. If you need any political advice along the way, I'm happy to help. And I really, I will, with all sincerity, I really am glad that you have not been put off by the absurdity of our politics, and that there's still that interest. And I hope many people who see you doing it will follow suit and say, look, I've contributor. I have a lot to contribute, and I'm going to contribute in politics, because I do have this great worry that we're going to see people not leave the sidelines in a way that you seem to be willing to do because of the state of our politics. So I appreciate you joining.
That's very kind. I mean, but let me just say this, which is that if there are people like that on the sidelines and they come in, they can flood the zone. They can come in and flood the zone and change the tone.
We'll leave with that optimism.
We can leave with that optimism. Okay. Thanks, Dave.
Thanks for joining me on this episode of Uncommons. A special shout out, by the way, to Beach's Sandbox, which is where we are recording this. You might hear the daycare that is happening right beside us. As always, you can reach us with topics, with guests, with ideas at BEY8 on social media and info@BEY8.ca by email. And otherwise, until next time.